Hey YouTube, this is Pervious1030 with Tin Can Gardener, and it is Martin Luther King Day. I'm a little bored, so I decided to do a video on some of the easiest plants for beginner gardeners to grow. We're going to start off with something simple. Greens, lettuce, things of that nature, spinach. Pretty easy to grow, and seeds easy. And as long as you keep it in the shade. Some lettuces like the heat, but it depends on where you live. Down here in South Florida, you got to garden in the winter months whenever it gets a little bit cooler like it is right now. So lettuce is a good choice. Any greens and things like that. Not so much corn. Corn's easy to grow, but it requires a lot of fertilizer, and if you are growing corn and your neighbor's growing a different type of corn, they crossbreed the pollen and it's just bad. So unless you really know what you're doing, you know, something like corn might not be the best idea. Okay, let's see what else I got going on here. Beans. These are some of my favorite things to grow because they're pretty easy. I like pole beans. I just like them because they taste better to me. But bush beans tend to be a little bit more productive sometimes. So beans are pretty easy to grow. They do not take a lot of nitrogen, which means you don't have to feed them a lot. They actually fix nitrogen in the soil. That's why people plant beans with corn and squash and do the Three Sisters garden. Because if you have a plant that requires a lot of nitrogen like corn, then you might want to consider beans or peas to plant around there. And make sure you check out the yield of what you're growing, and you know, that way you can get an idea of how much you'll be harvesting from. Alright, more beans. I have a lot of different kinds of beans. Beans come in all sorts of colors, shapes, and sizes. Tomatoes. Cherry tomatoes are, excuse me, my nose itches. Cherry tomatoes are fairly easy to grow. They produce pretty well. Most times whenever I grow a cherry tomato plant, I get more cherry tomatoes than I know what to do with. Some saucing tomatoes are the same way, like romaine. However, I do have a saucing tomato called a Jersey Giant, and that damn thing is so stubborn I can't get it to produce fruit. So, you know, that's another adventure for another time. But some saucing tomatoes, like the Lungos, they produce pretty good too. So, usually get a pretty good yield out of tomatoes. A little tip for tomatoes is eggshells. I've seen people crush them up real fine into a powder, and then they put vinegar in the eggshells, and what that does is it balances it out, and you have a direct lime-like fertilizer that you can put right on your tomato plant roots, and it won't hurt them or anything. Tomatoes can be eaten green. The big ones, they can be sliced up, covered in flour, and eaten. They're pretty good, fried green tomatoes. So small tomatoes, good for the beginner gardener. Okay, here I have average sized tomatoes and okra. Some of these average sized tomatoes are ideal because they're an early type, like early girls, better boys, things like that. So if you're an impatient gardener, early smaller type tomatoes might be a good idea. And I have okra. Okra, it's a little bit more difficult. If you can grow tomatoes, I believe you can grow okra. They have beautiful flowers, and okra tastes pretty good. And it can also be left to harden on the vine. You get these little horns, and they get really hard, and they sound like a rattle whenever you shake them. So they can be fun for kids too, you know, little things like that. And I do have a type of okra right there that is a coffee okra, which I really am excited to try that out. So average tomatoes for the beginning gardener, good. Now, I also have large tomatoes. Here's the thing with large tomatoes. Usually They don't produce that many tomatoes. Some varieties do, and some of them are susceptible to certain diseases, and some of them aren't. It takes a long time to produce, and you're not going to get that big of a yield. And that's just one of the things about bigger tomatoes. But they taste delicious, and what you do get is pretty good. So that's the large tomatoes. I'm trying to get through this rather quickly. Melons. Some melons are hard to grow, some melons are easy to grow. Depends on where you live. Down here in South Florida, however, I cannot grow them the way that I want to grow them because of the dreaded pickleworm who devours all my cucumbers and melons and anything else I got like that. So it's a lot harder for me to grow these down here than it is for maybe somebody in Michigan or something, you know. So melons are a good beginner crop if you know which ones to use. I suggest getting an early variety. Now an early variety might be 70 to 80 days. You're not going to get no 60, 55 day melon. I have yet to see one. If there is one, I'd like to know of it. But the reward is very nice. You get a bunch of seeds and some really good tasting fruit. I've seen beginner gardeners do well with melon, and I've seen others that just can't do well with them. So, and by the way, I'm going in no particular order on these seeds. I'm just getting them out. Brassicas. Brassicas are things like cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, things of that nature. Cabbage is actually of the same family, and so are turnips. But I listed turnips as root crops. These are a little bit harder. There's tips and tricks to growing certain heading vegetables. Like with broccoli, sometimes you got to tie the leaves up on top so you don't get the bolting and that sort of stuff. I honestly, if you're curious, go for it, but it ain't something I would suggest for a first time go, because you might be a little bit disappointed of what happens. You know, I believe that everything is trial and error, but whenever you're growing these, you got to pay attention to what you're doing and what time of the year you're doing it in. Most of your brassicas like fall, spring, things of that. They like their cold weather. So, and even like broccoli is considered a warm weather crop. But there's tips and tricks to growing that sort of thing, and the pest can be a real pain, because if you get a worm in the head of your broccoli, wouldn't that be something to find at dinner time? So you really got to know what you're doing. Alright. Okay. Eggplants. Eggplants grow really well down here in South Florida. I actually have an eggplant that's like 2 years old. It's behind my shed thing. You'll see it in one of my other videos. It's still back there growing. The thing's huge, and it might produce more fruit. I don't know. But eggplant, you can get an earlier variety, a later variety, but you need a lot of heat to grow these. This is not something that you're going to grow in summer, fall time. Like at the end of the season. Forget about it. So, eggplant, not such a good idea for a beginner gardener. Herbs. Herbs are good. Herbs are easy. Herbs can be grown in a windowsill. And that's why whenever people tell me, I can't have a garden, I live in a city, that's a bunch of crap. I don't care if you live in a efficiency apartment. You have room for a garden. Even if it's a 55 or a 5-gallon bucket with soil in it, that's a garden. Nobody ever said it had to be a plot. I mean, there's so much stuff on the internet where you can make hydroponic systems with pop bottles like this. All you would do is cut the top off, flip it, put it in there, and voila, you have a plant. So herbs are pretty easy to grow. They grow in small spaces, so that's a good thing. Moving on. Peppers. Peppers grow really well in hot weather. They do really well with tomato plants, and down here jalapenos and things like that are pretty easy to grow. Up north, maybe not so much, But I've seen people do really well. Like, I'm originally from Ohio, and I've seen people do really well with peppers up there, so, and in New York. I mean, you just got to know when to get it and hope for a good season. Indoors, anything can be grown at any given time, as long as you know how to manipulate the light cycle. Moving on. Squash. Again, down here, squash is hard to grow because of bugs. They can be very productive. They do take up a lot of nitrogen, so if you grow squash, you got to keep that in mind. They are heavy feeders, and this is where the beans come in, or the peas, or just aged manure works really well. Worm compost works really well, and compost tea. Squash loves compost tea. Both varieties, winter and summer squash, pretty easy to grow. Summer squash keeps a little bit longer. It'll keep during the winters, so you know that's a good thing to have on hand. Even for beginner growers, you could probably pull off a squash or two if you have the room. Squash is a vining plant. Some are. Zucchini usually aren't. They're like a bushy plant, and some yellow crooked neck squash is bush plant. But you'll get some that vine, and they will take over the whole garden and all that mess. You just got to know what you're getting. But if you have the room, squash is awesome. Moving on. Watermelons. Again, this goes back to the whole melon theory. How much room do you got? And FYI, most of these climbing plants can be put on a trellis. It's very important, because if you have no space this way, doesn't mean that you can't, put them in pots and grow them up a trellis. So you could even grow these on a balcony in a apartment. So always good to know. Make sure that you know your weight limit on your balcony before you go planting a bunch of stuff, because that would suck. But watermelon, usually fun, a lot of seeds, and usually pretty rewarding with the taste. And it can be a good beginner crop. Alright, here we go. Cucumbers and peas. Same thing with the cucumbers. You can put them on trellis. Sometimes they're a little bit harder to grow if they're indoors. Same thing with tomatoes and watermelon. You have to hand pollinate, and it is a chore. If it's outdoor, the bees will do that for you. If you're kind of high up on a balcony, or you just don't have bees, you're gonna have to hand pollinate. So if you're growing this kind of stuff and you're like, I'm never getting fruit, oh my god, this thing will not fruit, it's because it's not pollinated correctly. They do have male and female flowers, and you just get a paintbrush, you get in there, you get some of that pollen, just do that to every flower, and eventually you'll have fruit set. And the peas, if people are like, I can't grow peas, I have a little tiny space. There's a strain of pea called Tom Thumb, and they'll fit in a little pot, and it's just like a little tiny miniature pea plant that is pretty productive. So there are a lot of miniature plants that I call apartment plants, great for apartment gardening. They don't produce a lot, but they produce enough. So yes, I do. I would suggest these for somebody who's been gardening for a little bit. With the cucumbers, if you really don't know what you're doing, do some studying up on it. And that's with anything you grow. Make sure that you know exactly what it needs and what it entails, and what it maybe some shortcuts you can take whenever growing these types of crops. Okay, root crops. Root crops would be beets, carrots, kohlrabi, turnips, rutabagas, onions, things of that sort. But I don't have onions in here. I do have a bunch of other root crops though. And the easiest plant to grow ever, radishes. Now, if you've never grown anything and you have a black thumb, I suggest you grow radishes, because radishes are pretty forgiving, and they grow pretty quick. They usually grow in about 4 weeks, sometimes sooner. Sometimes you can get strains that grow in 28 days, which is a pretty quick turnaround. So that is, I think that radishes are some of the best crops to start people growing because they're fast. They, you automatically start seeing things come up out of the ground. That's a good thing. With other root crops like potatoes and stuff, it's pretty simple. You put it in the ground, it grows underground. I mean, it's a great starter crop. Carrots too, and they taste great. Now, with root crops, if you're trying to get seed, it usually takes 2 seasons, especially with carrots. Onions, things like that. It'll take a couple seasons before you'll actually get seeds that come up on top in the flower. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Like I said, anything you guys are going to grow, make sure you study it before you do. And here I have my onions and leeks. There's some pretty cool videos out there. Oop, there goes my phone. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that, guys. So there's pretty cool videos out there about growing onions and growing big onions, like show onions that are pretty huge. And leeks are good for a bunch of different stuff, and these are good for soups whenever you're sick and things like that. Now, if you want a easy onion to grow, I suggest growing green onions. They grow quick, they don't get very big, and you need a little onion, boom, there you go. So, always good to have on hand, and yeah, you can grow it as a beginner. Now, I'm going to go over a few things that beginner gardeners probably shouldn't get into too much. Things like wheat, you gotta have a good amount of space for this. So if you're in an apartment, you're not gonna grow any wheat unless you're gonna grow it in a bucket. So I mean, this is just one of those crops where you need a lot of room, and you gotta know when to harvest, and it's a process. And if you're gonna make flour, you gotta grind it down and all that mess. So this is one of those plants, one of those crops that you might want to second guess if you don't have the room or the knowledge. Amaranth is kind of the same way. These plants produce a they can produce a grain for breads and things like that. So very good. And here you got some stuff called honey drip sorghum. This stuff is used to make syrup and things of that nature. So these are all crops that are produced to make a staple food. And in time, you can learn how to do this. I mean, I'm not trying to discourage anybody from growing anything. However, just know that whenever you are growing this, they do demand a lot of attention and a lot of know-how and space. Alright, and some other stuff that I wanted to run by you guys real quick. The seeds. Whenever you go to the dollar store, you get some of these. You're like, oh, I got a great deal on seeds. Actually, you didn't, because there's a germination rate, and the germination rate on these is maybe 1 out of 5, something like that. So for every 5 seeds you plant, only one's going to probably germinate. And that's just something to keep in mind. Whenever you buy cheap seeds, you get what you pay for. And then, now remember, whenever you harvest all these seeds, you have an endless supply. You ain't got to go buy seeds no more. Or you can swap seeds with other people. That's even funner yet. So, there's my video on easy seeds for first-time gardeners. The lettuce, the radish, small tomatoes, jalapenos, they're pretty easy. Bell peppers take a little bit more doing. Carrots, beans, things of that nature. So, like I said, guys, you can have a garden anywhere, and anybody can grow a garden. I hate hearing people say, well, I have a black thumb and I can't grow. It's grower error. something you're doing that you don't even know you're doing because you don't know what you don't know. So if you really want to start growing stuff, get online, grab a book, educate yourself. That is the biggest weapon in my arsenal is knowledge and the application of it. I wouldn't know half what I know now if I hadn't read a book. So, alright guys, till next time, this is Pervious 1030 with Tin Can Gardener. Remember, if you teach somebody to garden, they'll never go hungry. Later.